All right, everyone, hi. This is Collette Fournier. Hello.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody.
All right, so I'm going to give a really brief introduction to Collette because we did get a late start, and we want to get to Colette's work. And Collette can fill us in on all the details. But Collette has an MFA in Visual Arts from Vermont College and a Bachelor of Science from RIT in Communication and Photographic Illustration. Born in Harlem, grew up in Brooklyn and Queens. She has been a photographer with Rockland Community College and an adjunct in the photography program, and has also worked for the Rockland Journal-News and the Bergen Record and freelance for the New York Post and all kinds of other things. Collette is also currently a member of Kamoinge group, and I did make a mistake in sending out that email where I did not give proper credit to, of course, Lou Draper, who co-founded Kamoinge. And Lou Draper is, of course, a predecessor, two predecessors back from me here at Mercer. And we have Lou Draper's book on sale in the gallery for only $20 or $25 with shipping. So check out jkcgallery.online for that. All right, I'm just going to hand it over. And Collette, please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to be at Mercer County Community College, where I first visited Lou Draper probably about 30 years ago or so when I was working on a show called There Is a World and didn't know very many African-American photographers in the New York City area. So it was actually through Lou Draper and also one of our past presidents, Buford Smith, that I was invited into Kamoinge. And I've been a member since about 2001. So for those of you who don't know Kamoinge, I'll talk a little bit more about it. We're about to look at the slides. And
Yep. I just have to share a screen.
oh, okay. Okay, so we're just sharing the screen, and then we'll go into the first slide. And the first slide was actually I designed for my retrospective with one of my friend's sons, who's an excellent designer. He did many of my postcards for my shows over the years. And welcome to everybody who's here. I see Sharon Turner and my niece, Maya, and my sister-in-law, Kathy. Thank you so much for joining us. This is a beautiful campus that you guys have here. So actually what you're looking at is my work, which is multidimensional, and I really concentrated on 4 different themes. And that is the spirit of the African Americans, the Amistad, struggle for human rights, Kamoinge, post-Hurricane Katrina, and then also West African travels. Okay, next.
Give me 1 second here. I don't know where that mouse is coming from. There we go.
Okay. So I share with you just a little bit of my background. This is my dad, Alex Fournier, and we're actually going on a tour of Harlem. Both of my parents were artists of one nature or another. Dad was a portrait artist, and he did sculpture as well as murals and a lot of design for churches and some bars. So he was busy and, of course, working all the time, did shows and did I'm actually not supposed to talk a whole lot, so I need to keep it brief.
I did not impose any rules.
I think we have like 45 minutes to get through everything. And then Mom was a Rosie the Riveter. Of course, she was a house mom. I'm from a family of 5. She was married twice. She was also a designer. She did beautiful, beautiful work as a seamstress, and she actually did a little modeling from time to time. Okay, next. This is an image which is very special to my heart because I was in school at the time at RIT studying photography, and it went into an exhibition called Jamaica Runnings. And my mom treated me to a trip to Jamaica for a week, and all I could think about while I was visiting Jamaica, West Indies, is what if I could be here for 3 or 4 weeks, or maybe 5 or 6 weeks. So I kind of focused on that, a little bit, knowing in the future I needed to get back to Jamaica to make some images. This particular image, unfortunately, I made 1 color print while a student at RIT, and the negative disappeared, which is something that I quickly learned happens sometimes in art schools. So what I did was I actually took the print. It was fairly well color balanced, and what I did was I took the print, to a lab, and they made an internegative, 4x5 internegative, so I was able to reprint to a larger format. This is Mama Alice at the Market. It was taken in Martinique in 1982. And in 1982, I was out of school for a while. I'd gotten my degree in communications and medical communications, medical photography. But I really went towards the documentary side. That was really of more interest to me than the medical photography. But what the medical photography program did is it introduced me into filmmaking, working with video, television production, AV production, and of course a lot of that technology has changed quite a bit now. But anyway, I did get a grant to go to Jamaica for 6 weeks in 1982, and then I tagged on like another 2 weeks in Fort de France, so that's where this black and white image was made.
I'm going to do a quick rename here.
Okay, and so something else I just wanted to mention, you know, sometimes when you're working with a black and white medium, and I think since I've made this print, I'm a better printer, but sometimes when you're working with a, you know, you're so concentrated, especially with darker skin, there's less reflection to darker skin, so you really want to get the tones right. But what that happens, oh, you want to go back just real quick?
Sorry.
Yeah, what will happen is sometimes the highlights in the background blow out a little bit. So since I'm a better printer, maybe one day I'll go into the darkroom and correct that. But you can see that the tones can handle so much of the scale. So now it's, in 1983, I actually went to work for About Time magazine. It was a monthly magazine that published to the Rochester community. And I met a very, very excellent writer there, Adolphe Dupree, the late Adolphe Dupree. And we came up, he wanted to collaborate. So we were really excited about being able to work with one another. He was just an excellent writer and researcher. And he told me about these black motorcycle clubs. And there were several in Rochester that we started photographing. And anyway, they were having this really big soiree, or whatever, big party in Buffalo. And that's where I photographed a series of the black motorcyclists. This particular group was called the Sunset Riders. And so I call it very specifically the men of the Sunset Riders, because there were women of the Sunset Riders that had their own thing going on. And I made this image in 1985. We also went into Detroit, Michigan, and photographed some of the motorcyclists, specifically the Afro Dogs. They were a really big group that had chapters all over the country. So it was very interesting getting to know a lot of these gentlemen. The fellow on the right-hand side, upper right, I actually worked with him at WXXI, so he was into television production. So you can tell by my experiences, I've had a lot of jobs. But in 1993, I went to work for Rockland Community College. Actually, it was in 92. I started out teaching as an adjunct in the photo department, teaching black and white photography. And by 1993, I was working in the president's office, and then a little bit after that, working in communications as a campus photographer. But in 1993, as a member of the African American History Month Committee, we came up with the idea that I was going to curate a show. And we called the show There Is a World Through Our Eyes, Perceptions and Visions of the African American Photographer. So this is a catalog from the show. It was multi-sided. It was a lot of work. It was the work of 25 photographers, 5 sculptors, including Adger Cowens. He may not remember he was in the show that I curated, but I'm proud to say that I, did a good job. And then we also showed the work of a sculptor, Gabriel Coren. This is Kamoinge, so I can say a little bit more about them. I've been a member since 2001. So I probably had a little bit of a rough start, because that's when I started graduate school at Vermont College, which was a low residency program. So it meant that I was working full time. I was teaching one photography class in the evening, and then the rest of the time I was focusing on doing my assignments for graduate school. The importance that I'll say about Kamoinge, this is our mission statement, that we honor, document, preserve, and represent the history and culture of the African diaspora with integrity and insight for humanity through the lens of Black photographers. And I think we all live by that credo. This is kind of a transitional slide, but it's important to me because as a student at RIT, you know, you really got to kind of play around quite a bit. I mean, it was an expensive school, but you got to experiment is really the better word. You got to experiment. And we had this program called The Cage, where you can borrow any kind of equipment that you wanted to borrow. And I borrowed a Kodak Retina camera because it was very small.
I still have one.
It was a film camera. Our hostess admitted that he still has a Kodak Retina. I never actually bought one. But what I loved about it is the shutter, or the timekeeping device, was very quiet. So I can go into a place and photograph, and you know, you wouldn't really know that there was a photographer in the room. So I kind of started playing around with motion. So this image is probably made about a quarter of a second. And I worked with either musicians or dancers. In this case, this is Garth Fagan Dance up in Rochester. And I used a tungsten base film under tungsten lighting and filtered lighting. And I experimented. I spent a lot of money on this project experimenting, but I came out with some really good images. This is 1991. And I was transitioning from a job at the Bergen Record. Actually, they had lost their budget, if you will. And, you know, basically everybody said, well, you got to keep your portfolio fresh. So when I heard of this Haitian rally going on at the United Nations, I decided to go. So I made a couple of images here and printed them. Let's see. Okay, this is Marching for Ossie Davis, taken in February 2005. And it was just, for me, it was a very different point of view. I certainly, you know, looked behind me to see what was behind me, but I love the lines. You know, I look for composition, I look for line, I look for light. The light on this particular block was very soft. And what I found out, so this was my transition actually into digital photography, what I found out was that the highlights don't work well as this film that I just showed you, but the highlights don't really work very well. But fortunately, most of the scene was sort of in open shade. This was an image from 1983, I'm sorry, when I was working for About Time magazine in Rochester still. And we went to the publisher, and I went to photograph the March on Washington, which was 20 years after the original march in 1963. And you know, art is almost non-descriptive. I'm reading a beautiful book right now by Adric Cowens, the president of Kamoinge, and it's a short book. It's only about like 115 pages, but he attempts to describe art and the soul of an artist, and it's the most brilliant description I've heard to date. Because I wasn't feeling this march. It's like, you know, we went through this 20 years ago, so why are we going through this again? So I just decided to focus on the young people, since that was kind of a different angle. So you're always looking like for a different angle that not everybody sees or not everybody is going to photograph. This is from very interesting project at the Garnerville Arts Center, which is in Rockland County. And we were asked to photograph Route 59, which is the longest highway in Rockland County, and it parallels the New York State Thruway. So I arranged to have these two individuals. Willie Trotman is on the left-hand side, and he's the Spring Valley NAACP president. And Frances Pratt is on the right-hand side. She's the NIAC NAACP president. She just recently retired, but she's still very active with the group. And then this was supposedly a site of the historic Underground Railroad. In later years, they found out this was not the actual site. The actual site was closer to the river, to the Hudson River. So maybe they'll move that one day. Next. But I have to tell you that I started getting very interested in slavery at a very young age, and it was very much due to my sister, my older sister, who told me that we were once slaves. And how that conversation came about was we were watching Uncle Tom's Cabin, a $1 million movie. Some of you are going to smile because some of you actually will remember.
$1 million movie.
$1 million movie that played the same film 7 nights a week from like 9 to 11 p.m., something like that. But anyway, in watching Uncle Tom's Cabin, I was watching how they were treating Uncle Tom, and it was making me cry. I'm, 4, 5, or 6. And I never forgot that. So my sister said to me, well, we were once slaves. Of course, I never knew that. But it really stimulated an interest. And so sometimes I'm lucky enough to come upon a site like this, which was in Sugarloaf, New York, and this was taken in 2009. This was October 25th, 1997, the Million Women's March, and it was actually organized 2 years after 1995, the Million Man March. So I had missed the Million Man March, which would have been a really nice opportunity to photograph, but I was very much dedicated to getting to the Million Women March. And they say by count, there was about 750,000 people. The news said 250,000, but the news is sometimes wrong. But the lady holding the sign, "I'm one in a million," is a woman named Marjorie Davis from Cleveland, Ohio. And I had press credentials at the time, so I was able to get up on a scaffold and photograph as much of the group with a wide-angle lens. This is Dr. Joy DeGrue, and she's being honored for her work in post-traumatic slave syndrome. She's at a lecture at the NAACP dinner, and this is May of 2005. And myself and another 20 people or so were being honored just for being active in the community and bringing culture to the community. What was very special about Joy, I just want to give you a sense of her academic history, but she holds a Bachelor of Science degree in communications, 2 master's degrees in social work, and also a degree in clinical psychology and a PhD in social work research. So we would bring her to Rockland Community College along with a lot of the social workers. We were involved in a group called Undoing Racism, and she was just very, very knowledgeable about slavery. And she was sort of like a John Henrik Clark who would actually go to the country if something was a dispute and look at their archives and find out what the real information was. So we really kind of followed her around like groupies. We always had her to dinner, and she just always was very candid about sharing information with us and students. Dr. Angela Davis, who very much influenced me when I was a teenager. I mean, down to having the big afro, but she's a doctor. We all know her from the Black Revolutionary Movement. And one of the first books I bought by her was Women, Race, and Class. And I never read the one about Are Prisons Obsolete? So this was taken in Detroit, Michigan, and she was part of the National Association of Political Repression. And what was so interesting, she was so down to earth, which, of course she still is. So it was really nice that my group was able to go and support her and, just find out more about her life. And, because she's a legend, she's a living legend. And as far as I know, she's still teaching. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Amistad. Now, most of you know about the Amistad incident, or at least have seen the movie. If you have not seen the movie, I really behoove you to go and find a copy of it, because it's a very, very interesting movie. But the Amistad happened in 1839. It was where a group of African slaves took control of the ship along the coast of Cuba. So they were actually captured by the Portuguese, who was very active in the slave trade. And that ship sailed from the southern coast of Cuba on a boat called the DeCarava, and when they got to the northern coast of Cuba, they then loaded they then got loaded onto the hulls of the Amistad. So it became a whole big issue in court. And again, it's a movie worth seeing. So they were actually set free in 1841. So for me, this was a transition from my photography. So all along I'd been doing analog photography. I mentioned before in 2005, I made that transition into digital. So we can move on. Okay, so again, the Amistad, A Struggle for Human Rights. This is a photograph of the Amistad in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And the Amistad was a ship that was really built by Amistad America through funds of people who were in the Connecticut community. And I want to press on, if you will. This is Wayne Bartow. Wayne was very instrumental as a coordinator of volunteer services with Amistad America. He was also by profession a mental health therapist, and he was the only African American seawright that I was familiar with, that I had come to know. So I took this image in 1999. I took it with my Momma, which is a medium format camera, which gives you a nice big black and white negative. And it was almost hard to get him to stay still because he's a worker, so and they were on a deadline to get the Amistad built. So this is the Amistad at a shed day. I have to say I was there on the side of the Amistad about 10 days before, as she came out of where she was being built in Mystic Seaport. So this is actually 10 days later. So it was very interesting that I was kind of running back and forth to Connecticut from my full-time job. When I heard that they were going to have a special opening or a special event for the Amistad, I had to make sure that was on my calendar so that I could be available to photograph. This is Amistad's ceremony to honor Sierra Leoneans who were the original slaves. They had come from Sierra Leone. The ones that were able to go back to Sierra Leone, this is some of their family members and their progeny that are now visiting the Amistad and supporting them. Warren Marr was a researcher, and it was actually his idea to create the Amistad. He had seen it. He was a researcher for NAACP, and I'm sure he had a number of other jobs, but these two gentlemen, the McLeod twins, were administrators for Amistad America, and everybody had a part in making this effort happen. So this is the send-off of Donald George, the gentleman with the Sierra Leonean flag, and a lot of his people are around him, and they're about to embark on a worldwide tour, which was actually going to be stopping through Sierra Leone.
Wow.
And this is Captain Bill Pinkney. Some of you might know his name. He was the actual captain for this particular trip that went around the world through Sierra Leone. The Amistad had many captains, including a female captain, and there were a lot of politics in becoming captain. So, but the interesting thing about Bill Pinkney is that he had sailed all around the world, so he was like really a first-class sailor for this particular schooner. And then the Amistad visited Rockland County twice, actually. And this is the Amistad visiting Rockland County and Haverstraw, New York. The group that you see here, the young men are drummers with a rhythms group, and then the lady on the left-hand side is Drusilla Kinzonzi, who is the current president of the African American Historical Society of Rockland County. So now we're in, I call this Sankofa 6, we're in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and you can see the Canadian flag. So part of the program of the Amistad was to get young people involved, bring them on ships, on the ship itself. I don't have sea legs, so I never actually sailed on the Amistad. I flew to Nova Scotia. But part of the program, they had a program called Sankofa 6, and it would bring some of the young people from, I believe it was, I want to say New London, Connecticut. I could be wrong about that, but they would bring a lot of the inner city kids and interview them and see if they were ready to make the trip. And then they would bring them to other countries, in this case Canada, and then the young people would work together, which we just thought was a very positive program. So they would kind of learn each other's cultures. Now this particular trip was it was a 2-week trip to that ended in Nova Scotia, and it ended in the community of Africville. Now, Africville was very significant in the whole slave trade, if you will, because many of the slaves, when they ran north, could now, with these new laws, could now be taken back to their to their original owners. So many of them kept going north, such as Harriet Tubman. She went north, I believe, into Ontario, built a little house, and then she kept coming back to the United States to bring more slaves into freedom. So Africville was a point in, again, Nova Scotia, very different climate from what these Africans were used to. But it was a point where they could continue north again along the East Coast, the Atlantic coast. And once they got into Africville, they could become citizens. This is me. It's very rare that I get photographed, but you know, this was a really important project. It's called the Post-Hurricane Katrina series, and it was 18 months after Hurricane Katrina, which was April 2007. And Kamoinge had gotten a grant from Soros Institute. Wait, just go back just another minute. Yeah, we had gotten a grant from. Oh, okay, sorry. So Kamoinge had gotten a grant from the George Soros Institute, and as far as I know, we were the only collective or group of photographers, group of artists to be granted a grant for all of us that wanted to participate. So I, was able to take 2 weeks off in April, mid-April, leading into the Easter Sunday, and I went down to New Orleans. These are levees at the 17th Street Canal, and the previous photograph also was from the 17th Street Canal. And what I did want to point out, you might want to go back just for a quick moment. What I did want to point out, you could really see that the houses are still boarded up, the grass is overgrown, so nothing has happened to that community since the 18 months. So anyway, when I was a kid, I remember like a lot of rock and roll songs, they used to talk about levees, and I would say, now what the heck are levees? So finally, one of my guides to New Orleans, an artist friend, a colleague, Mouton, took me over to these levees, and this is actually what was breached, which caused Hurricane Katrina to flood a good portion of New Orleans. My first impression of the lower Ninth Ward, and I have to give kudos to a woman named Ann Gaines, whose cousin I met at Rockland Community College. And we were in sort of like a group situation talking about, politics and culture and how they merge and overlap. And this gentleman says, oh, well, one of my cousins lives in New Orleans, so I'm going to give you her information and she'll show you around. And the interesting thing about the lower Ninth Ward was that there were no signs. I'll show you one photograph where there was a street sign. So you literally had no idea where you were exactly. You couldn't really orient yourself. But again, I'm there to document. I was able to photograph people, of course, interview people, and get more of a deep story of what was going on behind the scenes. This is a photograph I'm particularly fond of. So this is Sister's Place. I love entropy, and what's actually entropy is when something goes from a normal state of being, it breaks down into rust. So this is like a classic example of entropy happening. Again, this gives you a perspective of a block in the lower Ninth Ward where no families for the most part are living. You can see the overgrowth. Again, I love working with lines and composition and shadow, so sometimes you'll see those little things kind of pop up in my photographs. Now, the significant thing about this photograph, the woman, Miss Carletha, is in a FEMA trailer, and how FEMA handled this was they would put every trailer in front of the person's home, so that way if the person received mail, or if a medical person came to see them, or whatever, they would be at their actual address. The main complaint was, number one, they only gave people 2 keys, so if you had a family of 5 or 7 people, only 2 people in that family had keys. The other thing is you can kind of scope out and get a feeling of the condition of the FEMA trailer, and that was really a big issue with people as well.
Your voice dropped out. We had a little tech difficulty there. Just
Okay.
when you introduced this slide, just the very introduction, yeah.
Okay, so this is Miss Carletha's FEMA trailer, and FEMA had given people trailers, and they placed them outside of their homes.
Oh, okay.
So that way, if they needed medical attention, or if FEMA came to see them, or other counselors, they would know where to reach people.
Thanks.
And what's happening on the television is that there's a hurricane warning, and like we're in a trailer, without any foundation.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I got a little worried there for a minute. I hope a hurricane doesn't hit. Okay. This is Tyrone's license. And again, the project really gave me time. It was only 2 weeks, but it gave me time to talk to people and get their stories, and of course make images at the same time. And the significance about this photograph is that this young man, when Hurricane Katrina hit, he went to New Jersey where he had cousins and family to stay with. And so I photographed, he pulled out his New Jersey license and showed it to me. And I just also wanted to bring to your attention the black on his hand, which might look like a tattoo. It's actually mold. And I saw that in a number of people where mold had grown on their skin.
Wow.
Yeah, from the moisture. This is Ringo's and the X codes, and Ringo was a volunteer during this time. You can see that the church is still boarded up, but he came to keep the grounds and water the grass. And he also worked a little bit with the Army Corps of Engineers and some of the students to think about ways of protecting people's houses during the next hurricane storms. This is Ann Gaines on the left-hand side. So again, she was just a real jewel. I still hear from her on Facebook. And if you can kind of focus to the image on her computer, that is what her home looked like in New Orleans East. So the water came up about 10 feet. Her car was destroyed that was in the garage. And so she just actually tore down her home. And I have a picture of her sitting on the foundation, not in this series, but. And this is a young man, Mike, whose son used to live around the corner. So over Mike's left shoulder is, I believe, the house where he lived, either that house or the one next door. And he's just telling me that he never saw his son again. So they don't know to this day if the son survived. This is my buddy Mouton. He's in front of his mom's house in Gentilly. The neighborhood he lived in, and you can see somebody busted the window. And you saw, this is Easter Sunday on Claiborne Street, a thoroughfare through New Orleans, and you can see all over you saw these signs, "Thou shalt not kill," and that we've had enough killing. And what was happening, I actually watched one of the news programs on a Sunday morning, and what was happening was that when the hurricane hit, when Katrina hit, it was in the middle of a lot of people doing drug activity, and so they were like going crazy without being able to get their fixes and stuff, and they were killing each other. It was really nuts. I had to be very careful. I had to really be very careful. I spent 2 days with this family. They're the Watkins family, and Miss Alma Watkins on the left. They're now in Algiers, West Algiers, the western part of Louisiana. And she's actually on the phone organizing a community program that's going to happen on Sunday. And then her mom is kind of reminiscing, looking through old photographs. And then the next picture you see is a signature piece from the shoot. It appeared in our book, Kamoinge book, Timeless, and they gave it a double spread. So it was just really, sometimes it's just a moment of where you are that makes the shot come together. But as visual people, we have to be able to see that and put all of those elements together and have our camera with us.
Yes.
All right, these are travels to West Africa between 2007 and 2010. Right now, we're in a community called Ganvi, which is a community of 20,000 people. It was back then, and they live on the water. So all of the children, the adults, everybody, I can't say that everybody swims, but everybody's used to living in the water and fishing and boating. So they could really, take care of themselves in that element. So this is just a close-up of what the house would look like on stilts. And you can see everybody is sort of looking at us as I'm taking the picture. This is one of my favorite photographs of the Atlantic Ocean, Africa, the motherland. It's in Accra, in Ghana, the capital city of Ghana. This is that same area about 3 years later, and it was about 5 o'clock in the evening. Shadows were very different. I was walking on the beach. My companions were shopping. I was done shopping. And I made this image, which I really, really love. It just tells a lot about the activity if you could really kind of look into the image. And African eggs. Next. This is Elmina Castle, which I visited 3 times during my 3 trips to Ghana. And, as sad as the place is because of what it represents, it was also very, very fascinating for me to photograph because every time I was there, I saw different things. Next. I like to kind of play around with scale. I like repetitive shapes. So this kind of fulfilled that. And I waited for the man to walk into the shot so that you could see what size he was. So we call that scale in relation to the building. This is a holding cell for male slaves. They kept the males and the females separate. And this, to my recollection, this held about 500 slaves. And I was fortunate just to really light it with just one strobe. It really just, lit up with just one strobe. But you can just feel the moisture. As you walked in, you could feel the moisture of that hold. This is the northern part of Ghana. It's very close to Burkina Faso. And this was August 2010. And those shapes, if you will, were actually years and years of slaves digging with rock to make these shapes, and then they would use them as bowls to eat, or as you could see, to collect water. This is Asin Manso. We went there several times as well during the 3 trips, and each time you could see the water level was different. But the significance of it is that they called it the last bath, and this is where slaves were brought to wash off themselves, clean themselves, before they were brought to Elmina Castle or Cape Coast Castle. An ancestral shrine. And, this was so fascinating to me because I'd never seen anything like this in the United States. I mean, the gentleman on the left-hand side is our guide, Wisdom. I loved his name. The lady in the orange, in the yellow is Nana Drina. She's head of Chikawawali African Dance and Culture. But again, I've never really seen these monuments to this size. Now, of course, we have the Smithsonian, and then different cities are coming up with different museums. But I've never seen this much attention paid to slavery. But this, again, is from the African perspective. And this, said to me the pain that they're feeling about losing so many of their ancestors. And also how they greeted us when we came back to learn our history. That was so important, the greetings that we got from everyone. and what we would bring to them as well. All right, the next photograph, I think this is the last one. Miss Nana Drina actually was becoming a queen mother, and this was a ceremony they were doing for her in, I think this is 2010. And she's queen mother of a community called Bepoise. And part of what we do with Chico Wally is we donate clothing, we donate books, and when we go to Africa, we actually take books back to the students who were in a Seventh-day Adventist school. So I love this photograph because I call it a decisive moment, similar to Cartier-Bresson, because I saw that person walking in the left-hand side of the screen, so I just really focused and I waited for that person to step in the screen, and then I took the picture. And I thank you so much for attending. I hope the audience has some questions.
Wow, that was very concise. It was still under the hour. And
oh, good, okay.
I do want to ask you one thing, though, because
yes.
You mentioned your sister as being the first person to talk to you about your connection to slavery, and then your interest in slavery grows from there. But I also know from having conversations with you that you had parents who were creative and artistic as well. And was that, if you want to mention that a little bit and how that influenced you?
Yeah. Well, sometimes when people would find out that my father was an artist, they would say, oh, you've inherited those genes or something like that. But really, everybody in my family really was artistic in some way. My younger sister crocheted beautifully. My older sister sews beautifully, like my mom. She just is, it's just perfect. Her work is so detail-oriented. My cousin is an artist and went to music and art, and has now, started doing her art again after a few years of departure, just trying to make money. And as an artist, it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, that's why I always kept so many jobs, because you need to live and you need to eat and you need to buy equipment, which is expensive.
Yes.
We all know that the equipment can be quite costly. And I made the mistake once of buying a medium format camera that was used, and I never did that again because it turned out the shutter speed wasn't in sync, and I messed up an assignment, and that wasn't fun at all. So after that, I would just work if I had to make extra money to buy whatever equipment I needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know also that your father actually had a restaurant called the Sketchpad.
He did.
In the South Street Seaport area?
Yes, he did. Again, Dad did murals. He did sculpture. Most of his, forte was portraiture, either charcoal or oil. And I just remember being in his apartment, and some of the portraits I would just stare at for hours. It seemed to me like hours. There were certain portraits that he made that were just so beautiful and had so much, kind of history to them. If you really were around the work long enough, you could see that. But yeah, so in I want to say around 1964, maybe a little bit later, he and my stepmother, Lily, created a restaurant called the Sketchpad. And so he designed it on the inside. I actually waitressed there. I might have been a little young to serve beer, but I did serve beer. I never drank it, but I served it.
Sure.
And I washed the glasses, and I learned how to make espresso and cappuccinos. And I was told when I was in college, and I wasn't there at that point, I was told John Lennon would come by and he and Yoko would hang out. We had a pianist there, and she would play very lively music. And it was always an interesting group of people at the Sketchpad, always. It was on the border. It was right on South Street, 91 South Street, right across from the Fulton Fish Market. So we always get fresh fish from across the street. And, I documented the Fulton Fish Market in some of the area before it was gentrified.
Exactly. Yeah. I did the meat market. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
So I want to open it up for questions in a second. I just want to ask one last thing. I know you have some things coming up, and I don't know how much of it you want to mention.
Oh, I have things coming up. Let's see. Oh, gosh.
You mentioned a certain person interested in your work in a book.
Yeah. I've written a book. It's taken about 17 years, and I've searched out publishers, and I've talked to people from NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists that I've been part of many years ago. And the process is just amazing. It really is, because I don't want to publish the book myself. A lot of people are saying, oh, self-publish, but I don't know what I'm doing. So at this point, it needs to really go in the hands of a professional. But I am talking to someone who's given me some very, very good advice with my proposal, so I really have to flush that out. But it's 25 chapters. It starts with my grandparents coming from Guyana, so I talk a little bit about Guyana and the fact that there was slavery in Guyana, which my grandparents never told us about, ever. They wouldn't even talk about Guyana other than to call it BG. They wouldn't talk about it. They were in America now, and it was a whole new scene, and they would not talk about Guyana. And we also found out that they spoke Spanish. We had no idea that my grandparents spoke Spanish. So I really start with the family coming to America through Ellis Island, and talk a little bit about the history of the country and some of the cultural influences. But the other thing I kind of wanted to mention was before I went to Senegal, Dakar, Senegal, for 3 trips in 1987 and 1988. So I was in Rochester at the time, and I was invited by the Rochester City School District and also University of Rochester under Dr. Fred Jefferson. But what was so interesting about the trip, as I was making these images in my darkroom for About Time magazine, I envisioned the trip. I envisioned some of the images. I envisioned the music I was going to, listen to or put in the slide presentation. And these were slides. And everything really you had to hand edit. And we had this paper tape that made everything kind of go in sync. But it was pre-visualization. So when I talk to my students about pre-visualization, you're actually putting the presentation together even before you've been there.
Right.
And that was amazing to me. And I kind of storyboarded it. I had a young lady who was an actress come in and do the voiceover. I had sound effects. So now I'm trying to take that slide presentation from the 80s and make it into a PowerPoint or, whatever. And it was just an amazing body of work. And the thing is, I was able to do it in between the move from Rochester to Rockland County. Because by the time I got to Rockland, I didn't know anybody. So nobody was calling or visiting. I could just work.
Well, thank you. And thank you all. Thank you so much for doing this, for this presentation. And like I said earlier, this will be published on the Real Photo Show YouTube channel and the JKC Gallery YouTube channel. We have some photos up for about a week. Check out jkcgallery.online. And also, next week we have Wendy Ewald for those who are interested. So thank you again.
Thank you. Oh, this has been fascinating. Thank you, everybody, and for your questions and comments and just taking time to learn the work of a photographer. It's very humbling when people want to see your work and ask you about it. I could do this always. I love it. But I just need to concentrate also on making new work.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Michael.